One of the reasons that I think Renford's story is so important is because I don't believe that the majority of Canadians want to see people be dehumanized. I don't believe that. I don't believe that the majority of Canadians or people in the world, if they knew what was happening behind the prison walls, would say, oh, that's great, that's okay, let's keep it going. I think that what is happening behind prison walls is continuing, being allowed to continue because people don't know what's going on. And they don't know people like Renford. And I think Renford's story is so valuable because Renford himself is such an incredible person. You can't help but meet Renford and want to give him a hug and a high five and sit down and talk through life with him. He's got this wonderful kind of infectious personality, and he laughs constantly, and he has this big smile, and he loves his grandchildren, and he loves his friends, and he loves to work out, and in many ways he's a normal guy who's full of life and full of love and a really good person. And I think just knowing that about Renford and meeting him and seeing him who he is, and then understanding that this man spent 32 years in prison, and for many of those months he was actually tortured in solitary confinement, and he was considered so problematic that he was held for 22 years past his parole eligibility date. I think that story will cause people to question whether what we're doing with incarceration makes sense. And that is fundamentally what I'm hopeful for, is that we understand the humanity of prisoners, that people meet Renford through the screen or through a story and go, how did we do this to this man? And are we doing this to other people like him? And is that something I really want to be part of in my country, to be doing this to people? And so I think his story is so important because the truth is, Renford is incredibly strong and incredibly intelligent and resilient. And Renford has a phenomenal family that loved him through this and stuck with him. But that isn't typical. Renford isn't a typical story. The truth is, most of the people I meet do get broken, are not able to speak about their story, are not able to come out of prison and feel supported and get a job right away and do all the great things that Renford has been able to do in the 2 years since he's been out. And so he is somehow, for me, able to share his story in a way that I hope the public can listen to and can hear, so that they can make some space in their hearts and understanding for all the others whose stories aren't getting told. My name is Emma Halpern, and I'm a social justice lawyer and advocate and the executive director of the Elizabeth Fry Society of Mainland Nova Scotia. And I'm also co-director at Path Legal. I was a lawyer prior to getting involved in my work at Elizabeth Fry Society. I became a lawyer almost 20 years ago, started with legal aid, and then did a number of projects around access to justice and equity work. And I was really shocked when I first started doing prison monitoring that there were spaces in our country, locations run by our government, where there wasn't the rule of law. And the rule of law is an extremely important concept in democratic societies. The rule of law is this idea that we have the courts and we have access to legal services in order to protect the vulnerability of the individual from the overarching powers of the state. That is the rule of law. And yet, when you go into a prison, you see that the rule of law is very much absent. There are many, many rules, but very few avenues to actually for individuals to have their rights protected from the overarching power of the state. That was a profound, eye-opening experience for me to see that and understand that in the context of prisons. And it is with that knowledge and understanding that I decided we needed to open Path Legal. Path Legal is a nonprofit law firm. It is partly owned by myself and another lawyer, colleague of mine, Michael Dahl, and then also by the Elizabeth Fry Society, which is a very unusual entity in Canada to have a nonprofit with an ownership interest in a law firm. The reason for that is because we wanted to be able to integrate the legal work of Path Legal with the social justice work of eFry and connect those two important pieces to serve the public and the population of imprisoned individuals much better through looking at the whole person, not just their legal needs, but also their social justice needs, their healthcare needs, their housing needs, their mental health care needs, and so on. And it required a partnership with an organization to be able to do that. How I met Renford was through a friend of his. So we had only opened Path Legal perhaps a few months before that. And we were getting the word out in small ways. We did a little media article and so on that we were doing this work at Path Legal. And I got an email from a woman in Toronto. And she said, perhaps you've heard of Renford Ferrier, but if you haven't, here's a link to his website. And, basically, this is an individual who is being unjustly held way past his parole eligibility dates, 20 years at that time past his parole eligibility dates. And we're wondering if you would consider representing him because he needs legal help. So that was the sort of first outreach. It was an email. I then followed up with this woman who was a friend of his and tried to get a bit more of the story. She had started a website called Free Renford Ferrier that gave his story to the public. And he'd also at that point done an article with the Globe and Mail. And so I was able to see a little bit of what he had experienced and what he'd gone through. The first time we actually met was on the phone because that's how you meet all prisoners. And so I had arranged a legal call just to get to know him. And it was interesting, he was very much interviewing me, kind of as more even than I was interviewing him. He was trying to get to know whether I was for real, and he will say that to you for sure. It was like he didn't trust for good reason. He didn't trust lawyers. He didn't trust the system. And he didn't want someone who was going to sort of tell him all kinds of great things and then fall by the wayside, because he'd had a lot of experiences with people at that point where they had made promises or commitments to him of a variety of kinds of commitments and then not followed through. So we spent the first few months getting to know each other. We would talk weekly for about an hour, and he would tell me his story. It was a long one, of course. At that point, he'd been in prison for 30 years. And I was coming out of most of my practice being with the Elizabeth Fry Society, so most of my clients were at that point women or gender diverse individuals. And so I wasn't that familiar with the men's prison system, so I was learning along with him. It was very clear right at the outset that he was incredibly brilliant. His intelligence, I knew enough at that point to know that his intelligence was going to be a difficult thing for Correctional Services Canada to be able to understand or to allow ultimately, and that he was also very, very strong and knew his rights. So that was a difficult combination for Correctional Services Canada. There was this extremely strong, vocal, confident man who was having his rights violated, and then also knew the law himself, understood the system often better than most of the people who worked there. So, we started working together through, over the course of those phone calls, we started to get to know each other, and then we decided that we both thought that this was a case that we could take on together. Through the 2.5 years I worked with Renford, I learned how to be a parole lawyer. I became a much, much better parole lawyer than I was before, because I understood, one, how to work in conjunction with another person who themselves were inside, rather than to think I know better than them. In fact, they know so much more in many ways about what that experience is to be inside than I ever will. And also learned how to navigate the immense barriers and these hurdles that kept being brought and put in front of him. And we had to figure that out together. And so it wasn't a typical legal strategy. It wasn't, we're going to file a bunch of documents and get into court or get into a hearing. It was a slow, progressive legal strategy whereby he was getting information out to me that was actually information about the ways in which he was trying to advocate for himself and he was being blocked. And then I would get that in and use that to make submissions to the board. Because what was happening is that the Correctional Services Canada was saying one thing, but it wasn't the truth. It wasn't what Renford was doing. It wasn't what Renford was experiencing. And he had no way of advocating for himself or really painting the picture of what was actually happening to the board. But I could do that. And so that was how we worked together over the course of 2 years to finally get to the hearing and then ultimately be able to be successful in getting him out. The justice system is built like a house, but with a very weak and in fact broken foundation. And so you can never have a stable house if you haven't actually ensured that your foundation is strong and able to actually withhold the various parts of the house. And the problem with the foundation of the justice system is it was built based on, by white people, almost exclusively white men, during a time when we were very much complicit and actually very outwardly racist and discriminatory in many, many ways as a society. And we have held on to so many of those values through the justice system. And so that foundation is almost poisoned. The foundation is has these cracks within it that really are causing the rest of the house to start to rot. And what is so problematic is that so many people who work in the justice system maybe do see the rotting of the walls that's coming up from the foundation, but are just trained to look away and to focus on the few pieces of wood that are still solid and still strong. And because we are refusing to look at the rot, we're refusing to acknowledge that our system is racist. It was built on a racist foundation. It is racist. Our system is discriminatory towards women in many ways, and we don't talk about that. We don't want to talk about that. And so we continue to sort of rely on laws and that were written from many, many years ago. Precedent, right? We have a precedent-based legal system. So that means that the cases that happened many years ago often are what is driving how we make decisions today. Well, what if those precedents were written at a time when we believed that Black men, for example, were less than? Well, that continues then to permeate our system. And unfortunately, it also it allows for people who still hold very racist and discriminatory values to find avenues to use the law in their favor or to use precedents in their favor. And so it's a scary thing because I see it, I look at our legal system and I'm waiting for that house to come toppling down. Because at the end of the day, that rot will eventually erode the core of that house. It will come crumbling down. We are in a world where it is important that we acknowledge the discrimination and the racism that is inherent in all of our systems and in all of our spaces. And I think, one of the reasons that it's so problematic, what is happening in the correctional system, is it's still a place where that is hidden away. And so some of that rot is really allowed to fester. It is allowed to kind of grow and multiply in the space in behind the correctional walls, because the way in which the legal system has evolved has not impacted the correctional system in any of the progression or the progress that has occurred. And so part of that goes back to my earlier comments about a lack of rule of law there at all. And so you have systems that are, a lot of the time what you hear the prisoners will say, they'll say things like, oh, it's just a kangaroo court. And that's like the internal disciplinary court or the parole board, that these are not courts run by judges. They are run on precedent. They are run using rules and laws that have been written, but they are not evolving at the rate that some other spaces we would be seeing a type of evolution and a progress happening, because they are being run often by people with very limited actual legal knowledge or legal experience. Like, they are not run by judges, for example. And even in courtrooms where judges are making decisions, we still see some of that pervasive sort of rot coming up from the cracks that are in the foundation. One of the examples that Renford uses a lot is the fact that he was told to plead guilty because if he would plead guilty, he'll just get out in 10 years. So Renford was given life sentence with parole eligibility at 10 years. There is a myth in our justice system, and it is a myth that I find is particularly sold to Black men in particular, that, oh, it's okay, just plead guilty. Actually, I shouldn't say that, to Black men and women. I see it with women a lot. Just plead guilty, it'll be easier for your family, but don't worry, you'll be out in 10 years. A life sentence is a life sentence. A life sentence means you can be in for the rest of your life. You have the chance to get out in 10 years, but you are once again relying on a racist and discriminatory system to ensure that you have the opportunity to get in front of a board and to get an opportunity to be on parole in that 10-year period. And so Renford's a perfect example of that, because he ended up 32 years inside, even though he was parole eligible at 10. And arguably, and I think he would say that if he and I hadn't met in this serendipitous way, he very well likely would still be inside. His crime was being a strong Black man, a strong, intelligent Black man. The truth is, very little resources are actually put into people being rehabilitated, addressing trauma, addressing the root causes of the harms that they've experienced in their lives that have led them into criminality. The majority of people in prison have experienced tremendous harms, extremely high rates of sexual abuse, physical abuse, racism, discrimination, incredibly high rates of poverty and neglect. Kids, many increasing numbers of young people who've grown up in the child protection systems and finding themselves in prison. And there really aren't resources in our prisons to help folks deal with the kinds of traumas that have led them into criminality. And so, there's very obvious solutions to that. We could have way more trauma counseling in prison. Right now, it's almost impossible to get trauma counseling in prison. We should be looking at programming to help people reintegrate, employment kinds of programming, so educational programming. There's another myth that somehow prisoners get free university education. That is not true. I can tell you that I myself have paid for courses for folks that I've known who really deserved and needed access to university courses. They do not get access to that in prison. The sort of final myth that I, think about a lot, and I think that where individuals do not understand in our public, don't really understand what's happening, is around employment. So individuals inside make on average $28 to $32 a week for full-time employment. That is unheard of anywhere else in society. $28 to $32 a week for full-time employment, and they may be working in, sweatshop like sewing environments where they're sewing blankets for the Army, for example, our own military, or some contracts can be given to corporations to actually get prisoners to work and build, electronics for them. They are making no money. They cannot save any money. And this actually segues well into the need for things like Path Legal. How on earth could you ever afford a lawyer if you have a legal issue at $28 a week? You'll never afford a lawyer. And so, how do you ever fight for your rights if you're being unlawfully held in segregation, for example, in solitary confinement days on end? Well, there's legal aid doesn't cover that in the Atlantic. You're making $28 a week unless you have a family member who's willing to pay for you. And prisoners, because of their lived experiences and who ends up incarcerated, often don't have people in their lives that can fund their legal supports. Further, when we talk a little bit about reintegration, if you've lived in that way making $28 a week for, a number of years, how do you have enough money when you get out to actually start a life for yourself? How does that help you to to transition properly into society. So these are some of the myths that I think are propagated in our society that allow us to treat people as less than human often when they are behind the walls. I have heard people say that I would not have ever want my dog in that condition when looking in on a segregation cell. And yet we allow people to be locked away in small, tiny cells, often for days, weeks, months on end. I believe that Renford Ferrier spent 18 months in segregation in a tiny little cell with a metal toilet, often without a blanket, often without a mattress, alone for days and days and days on end, often without reading material, without a TV. It's hard to even imagine for most people what that would feel like. That's a form of torture. It is torture. And it's important, I think, for Canadians to understand that that is what happens to people when they go behind the walls. And anyone who is behind the walls, who is a prisoner in any federal institution, could find themselves in segregation, and sometimes for long periods of time. The carceral system that puts people away into prisons behind walls without access to family or community or even the media allows us to dehumanize certain individuals in our society because we don't know they're there, we ignore them, we turn a blind eye. And they are there, obviously, because they've caused some kind of a harm. I think that is clear. But we have to ask ourselves as a society if that's how we want to treat any members of our society, no matter how bad the harm. And if you go back to what I was saying before, we are talking about the vast majority of people in prison have been horrendously harmed in their lives and traumatized in their lives leading up to this incarceration. And so this idea of we will put people behind the walls and we will allow them to be dehumanized. We will take away their right to have a delicious meal. We will take away their right to wear clothing that they feel good in. We will take away their right to have a comfortable sleep. We will take away their right to have privacy, to be able to make choices for themselves. And sometimes we will even take away their right to fresh air, to their access to their religion, to access to their family and community at all. That is a process of dehumanization. The only way we allow that to happen is by accepting as a society that some people are less than human. And that is what we're doing with our carceral system. And it is so important that Canadians understand that we're all in some ways complicit in this. By allowing this to happen with our tax dollars, we are allowing for a dehumanization of a certain portion of our population because we've decided that they've done something that we disagree with and therefore we can then harm them. It feels so contrary to me that somebody has caused harm and therefore we will harm them. How do we ever stop someone from causing further harm? Or how do we ever make a safe society by harming people for causing harm? What we really should be looking for is ways to help people to feel human and to really lean into their humanity, because all the research and everything we all know about ourselves as human beings suggests that it is being human that actually makes us do good in the world. It is our humanity, it is the people we love and the communities we live in and the things that make us happy and the art we get to do and the music we get to listen to and the food we get to eat. That is what makes us make good choices and happy and positive choices. And so when you take that away from someone, what do you expect they're going to do? What do you expect is going to happen when they go out into society? And that is the fundamental problem with Correctional Services Canada and how it operates.